Around the time I saw a lot of PR for this film, a new and pretty distressing Brigitte Macron interview came out. And if you don't know, she's the wife of the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. And their story is quite similar to the characters in this movie. She was his teacher in high school. Her son was one of his peers. They, quote, fell in love. Yeah, right. Even though she had a husband and children at the time. Eventually, his father pulled him out of that school to attend school in Paris, but even after some years apart, they found their way back to one another and have been together ever since. Anyway, watching this movie with that very real story fresh in my mind again, it wasn't a very pleasant viewing experience, but Charles Melton has been getting such rave reviews that I decided to give it a go. And so yeah, here we are. Anyway, onto the summary. A woman named Gracie is talking to somebody named Brenda about a visitor that is due at Gracie's home. This visitor is a Hollywood actress. Gracie's husband Joe comes in then for his second beer, something that she points out in a light warning tone, and she asks him to take out the plates and cups because they're having a barbecue at the house. Finally, the movie star Elizabeth Berry arrives. We find out that she's going to be playing Gracie in a movie about Gracie's life, and Elizabeth wants her portrayal to be as authentic as possible, so she's there to observe Gracie and her family. We'll get into more details in a bit, but the gist of it obviously is that Gracie and her husband Joe met when he was just in grade 7 and she was in her 30s. Obviously, this was a serious scandal at the time and a crime. And yeah, this is why they want to make a movie out of it. Anyway, Elizabeth brings with her a box that she found at the couple's door on her way in, and it turns out that it's a box full of poo. Gracie says that it was probably from somebody who wasn't invited to the barbecue, but we already know better. And also, apparently this used to be a common occurrence, not so much anymore. As Elizabeth is getting to know the family, a family friend sits next to her and tells her that the couple, Gracie and Joe, are really sweet and they're a beloved part of the community. She asks Elizabeth to be kind in her portrayal of them. Later, Elizabeth is going through some tabloid magazines and we get a lot of information from the shots on these pages that Gracie was sentenced to 5 years in prison, that she got impregnated by a child in grade 7, a younger Joe, and that she was having his baby in prison. Another magazine article describes her as an unrepentant, disgraced seductress, an exclusive story just before she left prison. Elizabeth starts practicing her Gracie mannerisms in the mirror then. You'll notice this more as you watch the movie if you have watched it, but I wonder if she was fictionally cast because she has certain similarities to Gracie in the first place. Talking in kind of like whispery tones, and there's this very strange vibe, like you don't know if she's somehow manipulating you at any given time. Very sweet on the surface, but there's something sinister potentially going on underneath. We already know at this point that Gracie is pretty special, but we start to see just how bizarre she is in this very short scene as Joe comes into the bed that night, and we see more of their dynamic. He still smells a little bit smoky because of the barbecue, which makes Gracie sob, and he has to be the patient one to comfort her, and there's something about this interaction that just tells you that this is a regular occurrence. Gracie weaponizes her tears, she sobs at the drop of a hat, and Joe has to comfort her. And it's not just that she's crying, it's the way that she cries. She sobs like a child needing to be soothed. It's so brazenly manipulative. Then the family has dinner together. Joe and Gracie's son Charlie, who has a severe calcium deficiency, Gracie says, joins them for a dinner of quail that Gracie hunted and cooked herself. Charlie seems like he's in a mood though, and he quickly excuses himself from the table. It's not mentioned, but this might have something to do with Elizabeth's presence. This movie means that there will be an increased interest in the family, so you can understand his discomfort. And even if that's not the reason why he's in a mood, you can still understand this poor kid's discomfort. Elizabeth asks about the box of poo delivered to them, and Joe says that it doesn't happen as much as it used to. When Elizabeth asks why they don't leave town, Gracie comments, well, why should they? Plus, they have their whole family there. Elizabeth asks if she remembers how they met, and Joe says he doesn't really, but Gracie kind of talks over him, and she says that she remembers Joe's family being the only Korean family in town, and her son Georgie was in the same year as Joe at school, but it wasn't until one summer after grade 7 when he came into the pet store for a job that she really met him. Gracie gets defensive when Elizabeth asks how the relationship is between the other kids from her previous marriage and her kids with Joe. She snaps a little bit and she wonders how that's relevant. She does mention though that she does still talk to her other kids from her previous marriage. Later, as Elizabeth is leaving for the day, she points out to Joe that she and him are about the same age, and while she's only thinking about kids, he's sending his off to college. He's incredibly sweet and a little bit mumbly. In any case though, they arrange for Elizabeth to come and observe Joe Joe at work one of the days, he tells Elizabeth to arrange that with Gracie because Gracie's good at that kind of thing. Elizabeth meets Gracie's first husband, Tom, for coffee. A nice enough guy. They had a pretty good married life, so he says that he was really shocked when it turned out that she was a predator. My word choice. He says that he wondered what would make a 37-year-old woman have an affair with a boy in grade 7. He found out when they got busted at the pet store. It does seem as though he's made his peace with this though, saying that Gracie and Joe seem really happy, so what does he know? It's such a bizarre reaction, but I don't know, I'm getting kind of used to the people in this town having this oh well attitude about this whole rotten thing, except for the poo in the box people. They're not quite as forgiving. While Gracie and Mary, her daughter with Joe, are out shopping for dresses for Mary's graduation, Mary comes out in a dress that she really likes, but Gracie comments that Mary is so brave for wearing dresses showing her arms like that it's nice that she doesn't care about unrealistic beauty standards. This is a backhanded compliment if I've ever heard one, and really par for the course for a woman like Gracie to baby her son, but act like some kind of frenemy to her daughter. Obviously, this makes Mary change her mind about the dress because those comments made her feel self-conscious, which I'm guessing is the point. She comes out in a much different dress, one covering her arms, and obviously not her first choice. Christ, these poor children. I noticed that the kids don't fight back against their mom. It's probably more trouble than it's worth, given Gracie and her weirdness and her tears. Elizabeth turns out to also be a bit of a strange bird. She goes to the pet store and asks to see the stockroom where Gracie and Joe were first caught. She then acts out this kind of aroused scene moment on the stairs. Joe has been texting someone, by the way, and we don't know who this is. They're close enough for Joe to vent some of his frustrations about work, and he talks about his silkworm hobby to this person. So, I mean, at least he has a friend. In the evening, when Elizabeth is watching audition tapes of potential Joes for the movie, it strikes her then, and us, just how young these children are. It's deeply distressing, actually. Elizabeth visits Joe at work and they chat, and she says something quite disturbing then, that she has an idea of what it must have been like to sneak around with him. And she says, oh, she probably shouldn't have said that. And he won't tell anyone, will he? And he says, no worries. I hated this scene because I can only imagine how often he was told the same thing by Gracie. Elizabeth meets with Gracie's neighbor and lawyer, who tells the story about how through all of his years practicing law in New York in very high-profile cases, he never made it onto the front page of the New York Times, but he moved to Savannah and representing Gracie got him on the cover. He says that Gracie was very starry-eyed about her crime, that she said that they fell in love and reality never really set in for her, and it still hasn't. As they're chatting, Georgie, Gracie's son from her first marriage, comes over for a small chat, and it's interesting that the characters in the movie kind of hint at him being a little bit troubled, but he's kind of mostly the normal one here because he's open about his trauma and about how this ruined his life. Elizabeth points out to the lawyer that everybody in the neighborhood seems so kind to Gracie, but he says that they're just keeping the peace by keeping her busy, by ordering cakes over and over, because nobody needs that many pineapple cakes. And he describes it as a kindness. My theory was that the people of the town actually feel bad for Joe, and they don't have the power to save him or help him, so they don't want to alienate him and make him feel bad, but of course, he and Gracie are a package deal, and that's why they treated them with kindness. It might have been worse off for Joe had they been run out of town and ostracized. This is obviously not the case though, because people seem to be genuinely gentle on Gracie, even if they are just keeping her busy. How did she do it? How did she get most people in the town to be like this? Joe goes to visit his dad and their conversation is stilted and perfunctory. He talks about the kids going off to college and his father says it'll mean that Joe has more time for other things. It feels like Joe wants to talk to his father about more. He gives him those hesitant glances as though he's about to say something or as though he's hoping that his dad might say something, but neither of them says anything more and Joe just reaches for a cigarette instead. Elizabeth is now acting in a deeply suspicious manner. She goes to the local high school for a talk with the theatre group and she goes into a little bit too much detail about filming sex scenes in movies. I mean, the kids did ask and it was good of her to answer because at that age they already know about sex, but there's just a boundary that adults generally should have with kids, especially other people's kids, when talking about sex. But of course, she made it very personal and of course she just overstepped that boundary. Elizabeth offers Mary a ride home from school and when they get home, Mary runs out of the car saying that she doesn't feel well. So I think Mary got the ick from Elizabeth as well. Joe is sitting on the couch looking like his life has passed him by, but later we see him quite engaged as he's showing Gracie his silkworms that he's been breeding. To be fair, he's also really involved with the kids, and his interactions with them are pretty much the only other moments where it looks like he's not just going through the motions. Anyway, Joe is part of a Facebook group that's trying to save the dwindling population of silkworms. Elizabeth is charmed and she's asking questions, she's interested, and Joe is a little bit shy too, saying that he knows that this is dorky. She disagrees. Her just showing some interest is completely the opposite of how Gracie is about his hobby. I mean, Gracie was the one who told him to clear his bugs out of the living room, and she kind of makes him feel a bit silly for it. Elizabeth and Joe go out for a walk then, and he says that he knows that people still see him as a victim, but he and Gracie have been together for 24 years now. Why would they be if they weren't happy? I can't tell whether he was asking himself this as well, because he doesn't express it as a statement, he just phrases it as a question.
So it's interesting, in these real life May December cases, the ones that have been publicized, it seems as though the couple does stay together, but you cannot convince me that this is because they're happy and they're in love.
Then he tells Elizabeth that he was different to other kids when he was younger, and Gracie saw him. He says that he wanted it, and he also says that he and his parents never spoke about it. His dad was mostly focused on work, and his mom passed away when he was around 20. So perhaps later on, when they could have spoken about it, there just wasn't an opportunity to. Joe comes home one evening having brought the takeaways that Gracie requested for dinner, and he hears her sobbing in the bedroom. Gracie says that someone who's leaving town has cancelled her cake orders, but the lady is still going to pay for the cakes because they were made. Gracie's having a meltdown because of the time she wasted making them, and now the cakes are going to have to be thrown in the bin. Her crying is like proper wailing, like childlike wailing, and she's a bit beside herself. And of course Joe, with the patience of a saint, does a stellar job of comforting this absolute psycho of a woman. She tells him that she's getting tired of Elizabeth, and he says that the movie will be a good thing for them. It'll help people understand them. Again, in their dynamic, Gracie has babyfied herself so that Joe needs to be the adult. Oddly enough though, I find Joe to be kind of stunted in a way. Sure, he takes his responsibilities of caring for his family very seriously. He is a good man and he is there for them, but he's still completely controlled by Gracie, just like she groomed him to be. Later, she gives him a slice of the cake and he tells her that it's delicious, and we see her smiling. She's pleased with herself. His whole life is placating her. Elizabeth, meanwhile, is talking to her director, and she says that she saw the tapes of the kids, but none of them were a good fit because they weren't, quote, sexy enough. That Joe has this quiet confidence about him. He even had that as a kid, probably. The director, who's all of us now, says that she needs to come home. We see Joe texting his friend Michaela from the Silkworm group. That's who he's been texting, and I'm surprised that Gracie hasn't shut this down, but she has this way of being so wrapped up in her own thing, she probably doesn't know. They, Michaela and Joe, decide that they need to take a vacation someplace where they can go and see the butterflies. Then she says in the text that she thought that he was married. So we never know what his intentions with Michaela are. I mean, he could just be sneaking around because Gracie wouldn't want him having a friend. It's plausible that Joe just wants to hang out and go on holiday with no plans of cheating.
We don't know.
One day, Charlie comes out to sit on the roof and Joe is there, and what follows is one of my favorite scenes in this movie. They chat a little bit, with Joe checking in with Charlie, asking him if he's nervous about leaving home, but Charlie is all of us and he says that he can't wait to leave home. Joe smokes weed for the first time then with his son, and they have a bit of a laugh because Joe has never done this before and he coughs a bit. It's an odd but somehow really touching bonding experience. He is still very much a father figure in this dynamic though. Later, he tells Charlie that he's such a special kid, and Charlie, who is a sweet kid, is like, oh dad, don't be weird. And yeah, by all accounts, Joe is a good and present dad, and he's a good person, and the kids do see that in him. Gracie and Elizabeth are baking meanwhile, and Gracie randomly points out that Joe had been with more women than she had been men. She says that Joe was with 2 girls, and she'd only ever been with her ex-husband Tom. This remark comes completely unprompted, by the way. Elizabeth didn't ask about this, so this is random defensiveness, I guess. Gracie says that Joe grew up very quickly and she was very sheltered. She's doing that thing where she babies herself. Again, to pretend that Joe was a man and that she didn't take advantage of him. Also, I don't know if I can call her demeanor defensive here, because this might imply that she feels a little bit guilty or that she's done something wrong when she clearly doesn't feel that she has. She's just trying to control the situation, the optics of it, because it's in her own best interest that Elizabeth get a flattering picture of her. I mean, of course, it's a little bit delusional. Also, Elizabeth and Gracie and their scenes together are like cat and mouse, but I'm never really sure who's the cat and who's the mouse. You're always waiting for something to happen. Might they kill each other? Might they kiss? Later, still on the roof, and the continuation of my favorite scene, Joe is a little stoned, but he finally has an honest moment and he has a bit of a breakdown, and he says that he hopes that he's connecting with Charlie and that he's not creating a bad memory for him. He tells Charlie that he wants him to have a good life because bad things happen. Something has been bubbling under the surface for a while, and it's nice to see him let it out in his way. Also, we should talk about Charles Melton in this scene in particular, because
it must take some restraint
to not overact the scene with his son. Even here in this most emotional state, there's still something repressed about Joe. It's almost too heartbreaking to bear, especially because he's such a soft-spoken character who seems to try to take up as little space as possible. Thankfully, Charlie is there and tells him not to worry about him, and then Joe says, "It's all I do." Joe tries so hard, which in a way is hopeful because he never got that example from his dad, or from Gracie even. I mean, sure, there's probably a lot of trauma there, but he grew up to be a good man, despite being let down by all of the adults in his life. Anyway, this is one of two very unforgettable scenes in the movie. So the family goes out to lunch, Elizabeth goes out later then for some air, and Georgie joins her and asks if Gracie has broken her spirit yet. Then he tells her his theory that Gracie suffers from some childhood trauma. Her older brothers had abused her from the age of 12. He says he read it in her diary. I should mention that throughout the film, Gracie talks about her brothers. She tells Elizabeth these stories about how overprotective they were. It could be that Gracie is burying the trauma of that abuse with these, fun anecdotes that she thinks are wholesome stories. Just then, Georgie asks if Elizabeth could offer him a job on the film in exchange for more secrets. Thankfully, Elizabeth has the sense to be weirded out and she doesn't take him up on it. As Joe drives her home, she says that she feels she's outstayed her welcome there. When they're home alone and he's helping her with her asthma pump, he gives her a letter addressed to him from Gracie. He says it was one of the only letters that he could save, and their hands brush and linger on each other as he gives it to her. Then she kisses him and tells him that he's so young that he could start over. He asks what he'd do, and she says that he could do anything. They have sex then. And now, to be fair, they're the same age, so in any other circumstance, this wouldn't be the worst thing. It would actually be nice to have Joe date somebody closer to his own age. But Elizabeth is so similar to Gracie, and it's all so involved. Also, she needs something from Joe. She's using him. Even though Joe is an adult now and he's consenting, it still feels very exploitative on Elizabeth's part. While they're in bed afterwards, he says that he's had crushes on other people, but he's never done anything like this. It would break Gracie's heart because she's so loyal to him. Elizabeth says that whatever happens, Gracie will be fine. Then she makes the mistake of referring to their lives as a story, which rightly offends Joe. He says that it's not a story, it's his life. It's their life, and he realizes then that he was mistaken in thinking that Elizabeth actually liked him. He asks her what all of this was then, and she says, well, this is what adults do. Once Joe is gone, Elizabeth gets to reading the letter. The look on Joe's face when he looks at himself in the mirror, oh, this is grim. But later, he's sitting in the dark in the bedroom that he shares with Gracie, and he's thinking. He tells Gracie that there are some things about their relationship that they haven't spoken about in a long time, maybe ever. Gracie's response to this is very typical. She's dismissive and she trivializes it right off the bat. I mean, her usually quiet and compliant husband, who she cradle snatched, is suddenly wanting to talk, and she just sits there as though it doesn't matter, like she wants it over with. That's her reaction. He says that he's been remembering things, and she says, what has brought this on? She asks if it was Elizabeth, is it the movie? And he says, well, maybe, but it doesn't actually matter. It's just the way that he's feeling. He goes and sits by her on the bed and asks, what if I wasn't ready to make those decisions? What would that mean? Gracie feigns shock as though she doesn't know what he means, and then he asks, what if I was too young? Gracie shakes her head and she says, you seduced me. I audibly gasped at this, even though we should have seen this coming from her. Joe says then that he was 13 years old, and she says, don't give me that. Who was in charge? He finally raises his voice a little bit then, because she's trying to brush it under the carpet, and he desperately wants to have this conversation. He says that if they're really as in love as they say they are, why can't they talk about it? This is the second really great scene in the movie, and I cannot wait until the Oscar nominations are announced next month, because this is Charles Melton's for the taking. Anyway, back to the scene. Gracie thinks that this movie and Elizabeth is dredging all of this up. In the end, she turns it around on him and she tells him that it's graduation. Basically, she can't deal with this right now, and he's silenced. We see Elizabeth then, baby whispering, running lines. These seem to be the lines that she read in the letter. It's a love letter from Gracie to Joe, and she'd written in the letter that Joe should burn it because he knows what would happen to her if anyone find out. So the gist of it is that there actually was once a time when Gracie knew that they'd crossed the line, and she said that they needed more time in order for her to avoid getting into trouble and breaking up her family. So I guess even though she was a very sick woman and a sex pest, she knew. She's just been purposely deluding herself all these years to play happy family. The next morning, Joe is alone in the house and his bugs are hatching. They look like butterflies or moths. Anyway, he does get some joy out of this hobby, but Christ, if this isn't the loneliest, most stuck man. His daughter comes down then to greet him and he tells her that she looks great. As the rest of the family are having breakfast, Gracie goes out hunting. They eventually make it to the kids' graduation, including Joe's dad, who's there to see his grandkids, I guess. By the way, I was wondering about this, but it seems as though Gracie is allowed onto the school premises, even though she's on the offenders registry. Joe doesn't sit with the rest of the family, but he does get emotional watching the kids graduate. After the graduation, as Elizabeth and Gracie are saying goodbye, Gracie says that she hopes that Elizabeth doesn't think that the disgusting brother thing that Georgie told her was real. She says that she talks to Georgie every day, and that insecure people are very dangerous. And yeah, I mean, Georgie is admittedly troubled and he could have made it up, but we're never sure. I don't know though, I think I'm more inclined to believe anyone other than Gracie though. In the end, we see Elizabeth sometime later on the set of the film with an actor who plays Joe. She's going a little too method because she keeps wanting to redo the take of her seducing Joe because she says that it's just getting real. And yeah, that is the movie. It was deeply uncomfortable to watch. The score was very weird, but it was superbly acted. I will probably never watch this one again, but I'm definitely rooting for Charles Melton. Anyway, yeah, if you have seen it, feel free to share your thoughts and thank you for watching.